Hey! CK here, bringing you with a freshly picked prose. Let's go! So whenever I read a new type of story, I always look for this particular story element. Is it theme, dialogue, or pacing? Nay. None of the above. Usually, I look for the villain. A well-crafted villain, in my opinion, enhances both the story and the main character. Think about it. All of the emotional scenes that you adore, those angst and tragic ones, are usually caused by the villain's action. In my opinion, a well-crafted villain gives these raw and jagged emotions to your main character, which brings out the realistic qualities. Feeling betrayed, anger, angst, frustration. If the villain is written well, they can fully flesh that out, and in turn, making your readers suffer and as well be more invested in your story. And if it's not written well, like one-dimensional, I usually just cringe. So, how do we write a well-crafted villain that brings shivers to your readers as well as your main characters? Let's go! Numero uno. Determine what kind of villain you want to tell. So in my previous video, I talked extensively the importance of knowing what kind of story you wanted to tell. And if you haven't watched that video, I will link it down in the description box so you can be in your merry way after this video. So, the importance of knowing what kind of story you wanted to tell, it also allows you to choose the right kind of villain that you wanted to portray. For example, in my work in progress, I wanted to tell a story that is about hopelessness, a lot of angst, a lot of frustration. That has been the main theme of my novel, in which case they try to fight against destiny but they can't. So my main character does everything that she can, but she can't overcome the villain because it's her stubbornness that is bringing her demise. Therefore, in my story, it is a story of man versus himself, as I wanted to create this situation of feeling hopelessness and angst with my readers. Another example would be 86, which is a light novel created by Aceto. The premise is that the world is overrun by this mechanized robot called legions. The main character is a soldier who is forced to fight on the front lines. The reason for this is because his country has stripped him of his rights, mainly because he's a person of color. What I would like to assume is that the writer wanted to write a story about discrimination. At first glance, you would think that the villains of this story is the legions, which is fair, but in my opinion, the true villains of this is the country that forced the main character to be a child soldier. Throughout the novel, I could just feel my blood boiling because the injustice and the prejudice that the main character is facing is just so unreal. Second, briefly make them the main character of your novel. A misconception about villains is that they're just there to have a conflict between the main character. That is true. But most people forget that the villain is simply clashing the main character, but they're also the protagonist of their own story, just not this one. So going back to the previous example, 86, in the perspective of the country, they're doing the right thing. Why? It's because they want to create a pure-blooded nation. Yeah, right? It's so illogical, right? In this dying times, when people are dying, they still send out their they still force child soldiers to combat those legions even though they have no training. Awesome, right? Anyway, I'll briefly talk about that in my next video or so. I really love that novel. So going back, the perspective of the country is that they wanted to create this pure-blooded society. Therefore, all persons of colors are treated as livestock because they're different from them. The reason why they send child soldiers with person of color because they want to eradicate them. Therefore, in their mind, they're doing a rational and justice thing because these person of colors are less than a livestock and they're treated as pigs. Therefore, they're not humans. So, see how they justify everything? So, my tip for you is think of your villain and then try to think in their perspective and see how it changes how you write them initially. Third, which is also a direct link to the second tip, is to write a chapter that is within their perspective. So, one thing that I did previous years ago is I wrote a story that is completely in the villain's lens, and this allowed me to understand his ideologies as well as his psyche, and which in turn allowed me to create better dialogues because I know where the villain is coming from. See here, the problem with most villains that I see in modern literature is that these villains just want to have power, and that's basically it. The benefit of writing your villain in their own perspective is that you get to understand why. Why are they so hung up in preventing the main character in achieving the goals? What justification do you have for doing these things against the main character? So, again, going back to my previous point, problem with most villains I see are they just want world domination. They want to conquer the world. Okay, but what? Why? Power is just a means to a goal. For example, me. I want to get promoted at my work because I want to have financial freedom. See how I'm justifying myself? Your villain should also do that. It doesn't matter if it's just beyond the ethics and morality. They think it's right because it's their story, it's their perspective, and therefore it brings more better qualities and has these better ideologies against your main character. See, when you start justifying your villain, they get more chilling as you can understand why they think what they're doing is correct. So, enough of the theoretical things, let's start analyzing. Also, trigger warning, if in any way you're disturbed by rape, sexual harassment, manipulation, and other those bad things, you are feel free to check out, because what I'm going to tell you, or what we're going to analyze today, is Lolita, a very, very famous literature which garnered some questionable phrases and lots of criticism. So let's go. The story that we're analyzing today is Lolita by Victor Nakavarov. I apologize that I screwed up his last name entirely. So if you do not know, Lolita is a Russian literature, and the main character is Humbert Humbert, who uses his pseudonym because this acts as like a memoir. It is basically his justification as he recounts why he repeatedly sexually harassed Lolita and why he continuously raped her. And I do remember there was some murder involved as well too. It's a bad ride if I recall. Just a disclaimer, I forgot bits and information about the novel, mainly because it was so hard to read through it. But for the purpose of this video, I dabbled myself in some information because I think he's one of the well-crafted villains, because he himself doesn't even know that he's a villain. So that's awesome. So let's go. So first, what kind of story did Victor wanted to write? I personally think that there was no moral in this story. Even his literary, when he had like interviews, he said that this story doesn't have any morals at all. But as I read through it, I like to think that the purpose of this story is how a rapist tries to justify his actions and why he did those things to Lolita. Like, the whole novel is him pleading to the jury why he did everything was in the name of love. The whole novel was all fancy prose, written so strongly with eros and love and romance. So second, backstory. So the reason why Humbert developed this pedophilia, because he had this summer fling with a 14-year-old named Annabelle, and it was unsuccessful, it was unconsummated. I did not pronounce that word correctly. And since then, all of these sexual frustrations pent up, and he started to refer these little girls as nymphets for a love that never happened. So while I hate discrediting mental illness and why this happened, it still makes sense because the novel showed his backstory, why he's like that. And again, it does not in any way justify his actions because ethics and morality, but in his perspective, it makes sense. So lastly, writing a story with your villain as the focal point of the chapter. So remember when I said about having this exercise and write your villain as if he's like the main character? Well, this novel does it beautifully. One thing I really like about this novel is that Humbert is such an unreliable narrator. And that's what I like, because like I said, villains are the protagonist of their own story, just not this one. But he is the main character, but he's still the villain of this story, because in the name of ethics and morality, what he's done is wrong, but he still pleads that he's not guilty, and he still thinks that there's love between him and Lolita, which is so messed up. And another thing about Lolita is that there's a film made by Stanley, I forgot his last name, and it is done brilliantly. The reason for this is because if you look at the shots, the frames, it looks like Lolita was seducing Humbert. And again, that's one of his justifications why Humbert did those things to Lolita, because he thinks that she's sexually making advances to him. To be honest, the most sexual thing that Lolita did to Humbert was go into his lap and spread her legs. But you know what? She's a kid. She's a 12-year-old. When we're younger, we don't really think about the connotations that we do. We like to play. We like to get ourselves in weird positions and weird messes because we're a kid and we don't know any better. But in Humbert's messed up mind, he thinks that this is what Lolita was doing. And in the name of literature, that totally makes sense. So, going back all of these analysis and theory, a villain is just a villain is still the protagonist of their own story, just not this one. And try out these things, these tips for you, and have fun with it. That's a cool thing about writing a villain, is that they're not bounded by ethics and moralities. They're bounded by their own, usually their own code of conduct, which is so fun to do. So, again, if you have any questions or any discussion points that you would like, feel free to comment down below, and I'll see if I can answer your questions. And if there are some points that you disagree, mostly with Lolita and all, I will totally understand that, because I did not wholly read the novel because it was just too much for me to handle. Feel free to comment down below. And again, stay writing, fellow wordsmith. Highlight that subscribe button and check out the like button. See you next time in the next video, which again hopefully on Sunday. Who knows? Ciao!